I want to welcome you to another session of study concerning the basics of the Christian life. And in this one we'll be looking at one of the metaphors that is used in the New Testament for the Christian life. One of the most fascinating studies in Scripture is to examine all the illustrations or the symbols or the metaphors, the analogies that are used for the Christian life. And we have one of the perhaps best known analogies or metaphors before us in this session today. I want to encourage you to get your Bible and perhaps even a notebook and a pencil, pen, and write down a few items of interest as we go along in our study today. We're in Hebrews chapter 12, and we're going to read only the first 3 verses of Hebrews 12. Let me remind you of the setting of this passage. We're nearing the conclusion now of the book of Hebrews when we reach this point, and we have a number of passages of application, practical passages in front of us in the remainder of the book. We've just come through, at this reading, the great 11th chapter of Hebrews, the greatest chapter in the entire book, which is renowned as the faith chapter of the book of Hebrews. Now we're going to read, right after the conclusion of that chapter, the first 3 verses of chapter 12 about the analogy of the Christian race. So here are the words of Hebrews 12, 1 through 3, reading from the King James Bible. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. Now, someone called Hebrews chapter 11 God's Westminster Abbey. Someone else called it the Hall of Fame of Faith, or Faith's Hall of Fame. It's a lineup of some of the great heroic names of history, and especially of biblical history. Those who, though they struggled with themselves, with their world, their flesh, Satan, they nonetheless won singular victories, each in their walk with God, and thus are included in this great Faith's Hall of Fame. And then we turn the chapter from 11, turn the page from chapter 11 into chapter 12, and we immediately meet this great analogy or this great metaphor of the Christian life. So I want to talk to you in this session about the Christian race. I will look at 3 things. Each key word begins with the letter I. So if you're taking notes in black ink, I'm going to give you 3 black I's. And I hope they do you no damage whatsoever. I want us to begin by looking at the illustration that is used here. He said, let us run with patience the race that is set before us. And this gives us our title for this study, The Running of the Christian Race. And it also tells us what kind of life the Christian life is. If we can decipher the meaning of the word race as an analogy of a Christian and the Christian life, then we can determine some significant things about the Christian life. And that's exactly what I would like to do in this study. I want to mention 3 things that are pointed out under this illustration of the Christian life as a race, and ask you to consider them with me. What kind of life is the Christian life? First, we're told here that it is an appointed or an assigned life. Notice that the text calls it the race that is set before us. The Christian race is not a race that is selected by the runner. He doesn't determine the course. He doesn't determine the load. He doesn't determine the difficulty or the obstacles of the race. He doesn't determine the length of the race. He simply runs in the race that is set before him. It is a clearly appointed life. This is what track authorities would call an invitational race. It means that only those who are invited, and only those who are willing to abide by the specifications of the one who has enlisted them to run, only they may run in this race. The course is already chosen for the runner once he enters. It is not a matter of his own selection. He chooses none of the factors and features about this race. And he is responsible to run the race that is clearly set before him, not the race of somebody else's choosing, or not the race of his own choosing, but this is the race that God has assigned and designated and appointed for him. I remember in my generation, back when I was very young, a quite popular story. In fact, it was one of two stories that captivated my attention about little engines or little train engines. This particular one was the simpler of the two. This was the story of a little train engine that became weary of the track that it had to run on. It never got to vary on any pattern of travel. It always had to stay on the assigned track. And it began to protest. It said, "I want to cross the fields and climb the mountains. I'm tired of staying on these two tracks." And one day it decided to make its move, and it bolted from the tracks. It jumped the tracks and started off across country. Of course, you know what happened. When it struck a sandy area, or when it got in a swamp, or a mud hole, or it ran into rocks or trees, its progress ground to a halt. It could not move at all, so all of its vaunted desire to go anywhere of its own choosing was defeated. And then it began to appreciate the fact that it is only free when it runs on the tracks that it was made to run on. The same is true of a Christian. He should consult the one who enlists him in the race to begin with, and simply consent to run according to his specifications and his designation for this race. So this is an appointed race. In Psalm 37 verse 23 we find these words, "The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord." I've added these other factors. The stops of a good man are also orchestrated by the Lord. The stumblings of a good man are overcome by the Lord. And the schedule of a good man may be at any time overruled by the Lord. But it always is the Lord who determines the course and not the runner himself. This is an appointed life, an assigned life, and freedom is only found if we fulfill the assignment and live according to the appointment. So the Christian life in this illustration is an appointed or an assigned life. Then look at a second factor about it. The Christian life is also an extremely active or an extremely aggressive life, and this is by appointment and assignment. This is according to the one who set the course for the race. He said, "Let us run." May I say that again? Let us run with patience the race that is set before us. The Christian life is not a lingering life. It's not a wandering life. It's not a lounging life. It's not simply a casual life. Many have talked about the Christian life being totally passive when we throw ourselves out of gear and all the performance is done by God. But that's somewhat misleading, because the participant himself is the one running this race. I remember hearing the facetious story of one of the great American statesmen of his day and my day. His name was Averell Harriman. He was the appointed representative of the United States in many meetings of international settings or other nations. And he was appointed as as the national ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to France. And his friends were a little bit shocked at the appointment. One of them said to him one day, "Averill, how is your French?" And Averill smiled and rather quietly said, "My French is wonderful, my friend, except for the verbs." Now think of that statement. My French is wonderful, all except the verbs. Now, the Christian is in a life that has many, many, many possibilities in words. The Christian vocabulary has some incredible nouns in it, such as the word master, savior, redeemer, Lord, repentance, faith, forgiveness, life, etc., etc. Many, many wonderful nouns. It has many wonderful adjectives in it, such as excellent, wonderful, unsearchable, unspeakable, unquenchable, many wonderful adjectives. But it also has many, many, many captivating verbs. And really, when you come down to it, the key words of a language usually are the action words or the verbs. Think of the verbs of the Christian life, the Christian vocabulary. There's come, there's go, follow, serve, give, love, share, and the flagship term of my vocabulary as a Christian, make disciples. But the interesting thing is that many Christians are strong on the nouns and very strong on the adjectives, but they know almost nothing about the verbs. Their one primary action as Christians is to rut their way to church services and back again. And otherwise, they are never aggressive, they're never active, they're never proactive, they never aggressively serve anybody else in the Christian life or try to reach anybody else in the Christian life. Their coming and going has to do with church. So all of the verbs that point out the real aggressive action of the Christian life are wasted on them, and they never fulfill them. But in contrast to this, the Christian life of the New Testament is a very active, a very aggressive life. Then there's a third feature about the Christian life seen in this illustration of the running of the race. The Christian life is not only an appointed and assigned life, it's not only an active and aggressive life, the Christian life may be an agonizing life. Now, where do I find that in this passage? Well, the word translated race here is the word agona, from which we actually derive our English word to agonize. So the Christian will make this discovery as he long runs this race. Sometimes this race is a very testing obstacle course. It has all kinds of handicaps and difficulties and barriers and hindrances along the way. Some years ago, I read with great interest in studying some mythological stories, some stories especially out of Greek mythology. I came across the story of Atalanta and the golden apples. That's the name of the story in mythology. It's a story of a king's daughter named Atalanta. She was born streamlined of body and very fleet of foot. When he discovered how fast she was, the king made an offer, especially as she was maturing toward marriageable age. He said, anyone who can beat her in a foot race of a certain length will win her hand in marriage. But there's a flip side to the rule. If anybody enters to win and they get ahead of her and she catches them, she can throw a spear and stab them in the back and put them to death. So it's either win all or lose all in this race. And so in one race, she won every race against every potential suitor that came along until she ran against a young man named Hippomenes. Hippomenes came strangely armed to the race. he carried at his belt a little bag. And in that bag he carried 3 golden apples which he had secured for the running of this race. And here's what he did. As they started, and she easily broke ahead, and he allowed her to do so he would be in no threat. But when she got far enough away where he could test this, he reached into the bag, pulled out the first golden apple, and diagonally threw it across her path in front of her. When the sunshine struck the gold of that apple, she was immediately very interested in what had gone across her path. She realized she was considerably ahead of him. She knew she could catch him at any time, so she jumped off the trail, off the track, ran over and retrieved the golden apple, came back carrying it in her hand, and easily passed him, laughing at him as she went by. When she got a certain distance ahead again, he pulled out the second golden apple and flung it diagonally across her path. And again she saw it. She rushed out into the field, picked it up, came back, and easily passed him a second time. Then they were nearing the end of the race, and he took the apple at the appropriate time, the third apple, and cast it diagonally across her trail. She again rushed out into the field, picked it up, came back, thinking she could pass him, but she had mistimed this one, and this time he breasted the tape just before she passed him, won the race, and he won her hand in marriage and became heir to the king's estate. Now, what's the illustration? The illustration is that life affords 3 enticing golden apples that become temptations to those really desiring to run the proper race in life. Those 3 golden apples are the world with all of its glamour and glitter, Satan with all of his guile and enticement and seduction, and the flesh, the one that arises from the inside but becomes compliant with Satan and the world on the outside, and thus the Christian, distracted by these, can easily lose the race. This may be an agonizing race. So this is the illustration, the first point of our study. Now let's look secondly at the instructions that are found in this metaphor, the running of the Christian race. Twice in our text we find the words, "let us." Seeing we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. So there's some very significant and specific instructions for the running of this race in this text. I want to mention 4 key instructions that must be kept by any aspiring Christian if he's going to properly run this race. He cannot risk the violation of any one of these instructions. Let me simply mention them as they occur in the text. If I'm going to run this race properly and win, first, I must listen to the witnesses who encourage me. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin that does so beset us on the basis of the fact that there is a great cloud of witnesses surrounding me. Now, what does that mean? Well, I think the picture is that of a grandstand around a running track or a racetrack or an athletic field. And the grandstand may, at an event time, be crowded with thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands of people. But the question here is, what does it mean when it calls them a cloud of witnesses? Because the word witness may mean a spectator to something, or it may mean one who testifies about something. Well, quite obviously, this does not refer to these witnesses as spectators. That means all of these people who were heroes in Faith's Hall of Fame in chapter 11 are not in heaven now looking down on us. They are in effect in the grandstand calling out their encouragement to us, though they do not observe or witness by sight what we are doing. I mention again that chapter 11 has been called God's Westminster Abbey, or Faith's Hall of Fame. It is absolutely loaded with people who were successful at key points in their running of this race for God's sake and for their own and for the sake of many, many other people. These are not watchers. They're not watching us. They're witnesses. They're testifying to us about their own victory to encourage us to run. They are not spectators of our race. They are speakers concerning their own race. They are silent spokesmen speaking across many, many centuries to encourage us, to let us know that this race can be won, and to give us their own testimony. Each one of them testifies to me today about the necessity of faith and the nature of faith and the power of faith. In fact, speaking of Abel, chapter 11 verse 4 says, he being dead yet speaks. He speaks his testimony of encouragement to me and to us across the centuries. So we must listen to the witnesses who encourage us. Here's the second factor in the instructions. Number 2, we must lay aside the weights that encumber us. Let us lay aside every weight. Now, there's a distinguishing difference here between weights and sins. You see, weights may slow us up, but sins trap us. And there's a distinct difference between the two. In the case of the race, weights are training devices. A runner would attach fairly heavy weights to each of his ankles, just as a boxer will attach weights to his wrists and make himself function with those in order to increase his strength. And then when the weights are removed, he feels light as a feather. The same is true in running. These weights are training devices. I remember when I was a boy and wanted to play baseball, I got a baseball bat. I hollowed the end of the bat and melted down some lead on my kitchen stove at home and poured that lead into the hole in that baseball bat to make it heavier so that when I would swing it, it would feel like a 38 or 40 ounce bat, at least that much. And then when I would put it down and get a 33-inch bat, much lighter, then I could swing it much better than I could swing that big one. And this is the idea here. Let us lay aside every weight. Now, every runner knows the value of attaching weights to his ankles as he runs in training. But no runner who is in his right mind would run the race wearing those extra weights. The rule is that if we would travel far and fast running this race, then we must travel light. I was fascinated to read in a magazine article some years ago that mountain climbers and hikers often cut the margins off of their maps in order to do anything to lighten the weight that they're carrying. Many small weights make big hindrances. Many small weights make big handicaps. These weights may not have anything wrong with them, but they just slow down or distract the runner in the running of the race. Someone said a few small moths may do more damage to a closet of clothes than a big thief would do if he stole the clothes in that closet. F.B. Myers said, many Christians are like waterlogged ships. They won't sink, but they can't maneuver. They're slowed down in any progress, and they have to be towed on any trip or into the harbor. Someone said, all that does not help hinders. And we must take care of those things that do not help, or we cannot run this race. Then there's a third piece of instructions here, bit of instructions here. Not only must we listen to the witnesses that would encourage us and lay aside the weights that would encumber us, we must also leave behind the wickedness that entangles us. Note carefully these words. Let us lay aside the sin that does entangle us. Now notice this speaks of the sin. This is not a text for preaching on besetting sins. It's often been used that way, this text has, but it's not what it means. This is not talking about sins that dog our steps and hound us and may occasionally defeat us. No, this is talking about one sin. The sin that is the sponsor sin of all other sins. You see, the book of Hebrews, it deals with other sins, but its primary emphasis is on one sin. Lest you be hardened through unbelief. That's the sin that it deals with. And it's the only sin, essentially, that is dealt with as the mother sin, the father sin, the parent sin of all other sins. So we're to leave the wickedness that entangles us. The word entangle means to easily surround, or to closely cling to us, or to enclose us, or to wrap us up. It is the sin that does so easily entangle us. What someone called the octopus grip of unbelief. Another vivid metaphor of what this text is saying, that sin easily weights us down and trips us up. Each Christian struggles with some area of vulnerability in the category of sin. When I was studying mythology, I was fascinated to come across the account of Achilles in Greek mythology. Achilles' mother, because of all the wars that were raging all about them, took him as a baby and took him down to the river Styx, which was reputed to have magical powers in it, or powers of invulnerability. And she took him by the heel as a baby, held on just to his heel, and lowered him into the water, and then brought him back up, completely covered with that water, except for the place where her hand held him at the heel. And it just happened when he became a man and was engaged in wars. He was invulnerable practically in any war in which he fought, from injury or death. But one day, an opposing archer fitted a poison arrow to his bow and shot Achilles in the heel, and he died because of his point of a vulnerability. And this gave to us our idea of the Achilles heel. Every person has a weakness, a point of vulnerability, and he may sin at the point either of his strength or his weakness. He takes his strength for granted and is weakened at the point of his strength, or he is weak and vulnerable simply because he is weak at that point. So he says, lay aside the sin that so easily entangles us. We're to leave the wickedness that entangles us. And then number fourth instruction in the passage, we must last through the weariness that exhausts us. There's a word that is used several times in our text and context. It's the word endure. Listen to it. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Jesus, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. Consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you yourself become weary and discouraged in your souls. So we are to last through the weariness that exhausts us and threatens to force us out of the race. I want you to listen to verses 12 and 13 of this 12th chapter of Hebrews. It says, therefore, strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but rather that it may be healed. So we are to last through the weariness that would tend to exhaust us. Verse 1 has a very captivating expression in it. It says, let us run with stamina. That's the way one translation puts it. Let us run with stamina the race that is set before us. Another translates it steadfast endurance. Another calls it determination. I like the word stamina. That's a coach's word. That's an athlete's word. Stickability, ability to see things through. This race is not for hotshots who go up like a rocket and come down like a rock. This is for those who are willing to run with endurance the race that is set before us. So these are the instructions. Let me recite them again. If I'm to run this race to win, number one, I must listen to the witnesses that encourage me. Number two, I must lay aside the weights that encumber me. Number three, I must leave the wickedness that would entangle me. And number four, I must last through the weariness that would exhaust me. What wisdom there is in these words, and how wise we would be if we specifically and individually, one by one, applied these rules, these instructions to our lives for the running of this race. Then there's one last thing to be seen in this study today. We've looked at the illustration that is presented in the text, the Christian life as a race. We've looked at the instructions that are presented in the text for running this race. Now we want to see the inspiration that is available for motivating us to run this race. In verses 2 and 3, we find this illustration. Verse 2 says, looking unto Jesus. And verse 3 says, for consider him. Our sole, only, exclusive motivation or inspiration for running this race is the same as always in the Christian life. It is Jesus himself. Where do I look for my example in the Christian life? Where do I find my motivation for running the life? Where do I find my pattern or my model that will set the standard for the way I want to run this race? You see, look at the text itself. Read through chapter 11 and note that all the supposed heroes of chapter 11, the heroes of Faith's Hall of Fame, were terribly, terribly imperfect people. There were chronic liars in the list. There were numerous murderers in the list. There were renegade sinners in the list. I surely am not to hold them before myself as the pattern for the running of the race. No, I am to look unto Jesus. Now, I want to explain two things about the verbs that are used in these two pattern expressions. The first one is looking unto Jesus. The second one is consider him. Looking unto Jesus, that is a unique word in the New Testament. The word for looking is the word horao, means I look. But the word for looking away from is aphorao. It's horao with a preposition that means away from attached to the beginning of it. Well, this is the word that is used here. This is not merely looking foursquare unto Jesus. This is looking away from everything else that would distract me from looking to Jesus. This is a present participle in the text, present tense continuous action. It means this is to be my habit of life. This is to define unbroken action in my life. And I am to clearly, if I am to win this race, deliberately look away from everything that would distract me from the running to focus my attention only on Jesus. I had noted on my little notepad here a list of things that I am to look away from. And these are very meaningful to me. For example, I am to look away from my own sin. I am to look away from my own self. I am to look away from the future. I am to look away from the past. I am to look away from failure, either the failures of others or my own failures. I'm to look away from my own successes. I'm to look away from other people. I'm to look away from circumstances. I'm to look away from my own ignorance. I'm to look away from my own learning. I'm to look away from my own helplessness. I'm to look away from my own strength. I'm to look away from my own supposed merits. I'm to look away from my performance, my achievements. I'm to look away from my efforts and my struggles. I'm to look away from self-righteousness, my own self-righteousness. I'm to look away from my own works. I'm to look away from my own faith. You see, this text means exactly what it says. I am to look away unto Jesus. So all of these things are extremely significant, and there is no way to win in the Christian life without that. Now, look at the other word that is used here to define the inspiration I receive for running this race. I am to consider him who, for the joy that was set before him, as the author and finisher of my faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Now, what does that term mean? It's just like the word looking away unto Jesus. This is a loaded word. It's a word analogizomai. That's a long Greek word, analogizomai, a 6-syllable word. It just happens that when you transliterate the first part of that word, the rest of it is a verb ending. When you transliterate the first part of that verb, you get the English word analogy, A-N-A-L-O-G-Y. An analogy is a pattern or a similarity. It means you draw a similarity or draw a comparison between two things. What this means is keep your eyes on Jesus and always set him as the model and pattern by which you compare your life, so that you're always focusing on him to move away from the differences between you and him, close the gap, the chasm of difference between you and him, so that you're so focused on him that he is subconscious to you, always making you more and more like himself. But notice the focus of both of these words. They both call for a very demanding focal point of attention, looking away from everything else and unto Jesus. And now making an analogy in your life between yourself and Jesus, and keeping your attention always riveted on him. I've always been, as long as I can remember, my father helped to build this into me, consciously or unconsciously, by his own interest in sports. He was not a radically avid sports fan, but he was a very steady sports fan, very intelligent sports fan, very quiet person. Unlike me, I got my personality from my mother. And so he taught me a love for sports. And I don't remember when it was. I was still a young man. But when the first 4-minute mile was run in the athletic field, in the athletic category of track and field, it was run by a man who was in a race with another man, and they were heralding this, they were booking it as the mile of the century. And all the sports writers' hype really made an athletic event out of this, one of the greatest athletic events of that century. And the runners in the race, as they vied for the first 4-minute mile, were an Englishman named Roger Bannister, a London doctor, and then an Australian named John Landy. And due to all the fanfare, there were many, many people there to witness the race. And it was one of the great events of track and field history. And the race started, progressed as had been predicted, and the race was won or lost in the last 5 yards of the race. That's hard to believe. But a race could be that close that it was won or lost in the last 5 yards. It should have been won by the Aussie named John Landy, because he was a full step and a half ahead of Roger Bannister the London doctor, when they came to the last 5 yards. But he made a mistake. As he broke down the last part of the home stretch, he turned his head over his left shoulder to see his opponent, to see where he was. And in that moment, Bannister made his move on the other side. He was already coming when Landy turned his head. And he burst around his right side, and due to the distraction and the slight distortion of pace that came to Landy because he turned his head back to look at his opponent, Bannister flashed in front of him, barely breasted the tape in front of him, and his name went in the record books as the runner of the first 4-minute mile. That will never be changed. The race cannot be rerun. So forever, Bannister's name goes in where Landy's name should have been had he simply kept pace, listen, and kept his eye on the finish line instead of looking to his opponent. What an illustration. Do not look at any distraction. Look at the finish line. See, Jesus is the starter of this race. He's the author of my faith. He's the pace setter of this race. And he is the judge sitting at the finish line to judge the winner and to give the rewards at the end. So keep your eyes on the person who will change everything to give you victory in this race. So we are to look unto him away from everything else, and we're to make an analogy between ourselves and him and always live to close the gap of difference in comparison between ourselves and him. When I was in college, I lived just 2 blocks east of the University of Arkansas. And in weather like we are experiencing here in my home city in Tennessee now, it's very, very cold and predicted to get very, very cold tonight, down in the teens, which is very cold for this area and for us and for me. I just came back from Africa, a very hot place in Africa, a sweaty place, a place unbelievably hot. I walked like into a refrigerator when I come back here, and I've hardly been warm a day since I came back home. But when I was in college, I used to go across the bridge and up to the campus when I was in college, and in a cold day I would be wearing a top coat, and I would go out, and art students from the art classes would be sitting on the bridge painting pictures of trains or some feature of the chasm where the train passed through our area, or a picture of the bridge or something like that, or just a picture of the terrain, something to paint. And they would be sitting out there lightly garbed at very cold weather. And I approached one day. I said, why can't you paint on the inside while the weather's like this? He said, no, we're challenged to paint a winter scene. And that's what we're doing out here. I said, but can't you make a picture of it and take it into the classroom or the studio at school and paint it from there? He said, oh no. We're taught to never copy, never paint from a copy, but to paint only from the original. This really came home to me when I got into the work I'm in now. I have a copying machine upstairs. It's necessary for me to copy a lot of material to send to one place and another in the ministry I'm presently in. And sometimes I copy sheets of material at a time and put them in an envelope and mail them somewhere. But I'm copying all the time. And here's what I discovered. If I copy from the original, I get a clear Xerox copy. But if I start copying down the line from the copies, the further I get from the original, the worse is the copy that is made. Ah, what an illustration. As a Christian, always keep your eye on the original. Because if you copy a copy, the further down the line from the original, the dimmer will be the outline and the image, and the poorer will be the copy. So I want to commend this study to you. Let me read the text to you again before I leave you. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily ensnare us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. May God use this study in your life and mine, and the life of anyone who witnesses this film, for his glory, for your good, and for the good of multitudes of others because of this being incarnated in your life. May God bless you.